Hello, today is Monday, August 11th. Welcome to episode 487 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Deputy Executive Director Martha Miller, and I'm joined by Senior Fellow Joshua Kaminsky. So, President Trump will be meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska after a succession of ceasefire deadlines that have repeatedly come and gone without any result or consequences. Since taking office, Trump has shifted from open-ended predictions to specific timelines, 50 days, then 2 weeks, then just 10 to 12 days. Yet Russian attacks have persisted past each cutoff. With the latest deadline of August 8th passing uneventfully, the White House pivoted from additional sanctions to direct negotiations, prompted in part by Stephen Witkoff's most recent meeting with Putin. On the eve of this summit, Vice President J.D. Vance publicly urged Europe to step up and take a bigger role in supporting Ukraine. He criticized European military readiness, pointing out that the American public is sick of funding the war and signaling that the U.S. is done funding Kyiv on its own. His remarks come as European leaders, facing shortfalls in both manpower and resources, scramble to build a coalition of the willing to enforce any ceasefire agreement that may come about. Despite overtaking the U.S. In total financial aid for Ukraine in June, Europe's military contributions in both numbers and advanced equipment still lag far behind American support, highlighting deep imbalance and transatlantic burden sharing. So the limits of European readiness are stark. A multinational force once envisioned has fallen short of initial hopes. And these dynamics within Europe fuel debate over whether what a viable settlement might entail. So Joshua, just would love to just hear from you. Over the weekend, there were some statements made both by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and also by Lindsey Graham. I think it was Rutte who referred to Baltic embassies having existed despite the actual Soviet borders. Lindsey Graham alluded to Berlin, East and West Berlin, and there was definitely talk about de jure and de facto, control over various geographies. What do you make of these comments? Are we looking at a deal where Ukraine will be forced to give up several of these territories?
I think the situation is, and thank you very much for having me today, is if we look at the macro level strategic dynamic, the fundamentals of the equation haven't really changed. So if we're looking at the United States is unwilling and unable, given its strategic trade-offs to the Indo-Pacific, to provide the capabilities that Ukraine needs to achieve its maximalist objectives, retaking all of those 4 oblasts that are currently held by Russia, which are not fully held by Russia, it's important to note, as well as Crimea. Ukraine is in a position where it cannot retake those territories. It is experiencing high levels of attrition, although it is increasing its capabilities slowly, particularly in first-person drones and other sorts of equipment. But then also Russia is not in a position to really enter into a ceasefire because it doesn't seem necessary, like it feels it needs to do so at this time. So if we look at the elements of the equation where we stand right now going into Friday, it is unclear what quite possibly could come out of this discussion. So the expectations that there's going to be a resolution should be downplayed. And it is possible things might change. President Trump and President Putin might reach an accord. And it's also important to note that it is unclear at this stage whether President Zelensky will be invited. That could change something today, next 24, 48 hours, and he could go to Alaska. I think the thing to look at this discussion is not to place so significant expectations on an outcome for this, but to look at it as part of the art of diplomacy just happening. President Trump, as you outlined, has put successive deadlines, if you will, for resolving the conflict. They've come and gone. President Putin and Russia have increased drone attacks, ballistic missile strikes, cruise missile strikes across Ukraine as these deadlines have come and gone. So clearly he's not feeling any pressure at this stage. So we need to reframe kind of what the expectations are. I think it was referencing before we started the call, Winston Churchill used to say, jaw, jaw is better than war, war. Well, we're in the middle of a war at the moment. And so it's still important to have jaw, jaw.
So another comment that struck me over the weekend was Mark Rutte's comment that that this was really a test to see how serious Putin is. What do you make of that? I think to your point, this is the art of diplomacy. Is this giving Putin a chance to demonstrate that he's serious, or does it provide a pretext to then double down on sending lethal aid to Ukraine, or maximizing those secondary sanctions? So we do have that sanctions legislation that was wholeheartedly supported in a bipartisan manner. Also, Trump slapped some tariffs on India for buying Russian oil, and I think obviously the idea there is that they don't care if we sanction. What they care about is whether their customers stop buying. So, I mean, do you think this is a test of Putin? Do you think that he'll demonstrate seriousness? And if he doesn't, because I think Trump seems to have realized that he's been played by Putin just like every other American president. What then? What will Trump? What will Trump turn to?
Well, I think going back to the immediate preceding comment about the U.S.-Russia relations, they've always waxed and waned between sort of over exuberant expectations and then constant lamentations and blaming of sort of the Russians for not failing or for failing to meet the expectations. So you're absolutely right. This push-pull of the relationship between the United States and Russia has always been animated by this very difficult squaring of the circle for it. So going into Alaska, it's going to be interesting to see is what does President Putin do? He's entering into discussions in the first place with President Trump, which is something that he's always wanted. He wants to be seen very much as that great power, that international leader that is speaking on the same level as President Trump. So you have two meeting of minds, if you will, of individuals who see themselves as great leaders. And in many ways, they are great leaders because they are the leaders of their respective countries, the United States and Russia. So they're having this meeting of minds in Alaska, and it's going to be interesting to see what does President Putin walk into the room with. And is he going to be belligerent? Is he going to be obstinate? Is he going to fly all the way to Alaska and come up with something of a significant gesture like, oh, look, I've gone ahead and done this. And we need to remember that President Putin historically has been quite canny about playing the role. He knows who he's going into the room with. He knows how to play the diplomacy. And he could very much walk in and say, President Trump, you're absolutely right. We need to reach some sort of agreement. But here are the list of demands that I have, in which they've set out pretty significant demands beforehand, which are unpalatable to the United States and unpalatable to Ukraine as they stand. If we invert the equation and look at what Ukraine has done from the meeting with President Zelensky in the Oval Office, which went disastrous by any objective measure, Ukraine has walked back and attempted to look like a constructive partner to the party to discussions. So the critical minerals deal, trying to, how should we say it, demonstrate significant acceptance and thanks to the assistance that the United States has provided. So very much playing a more constructive role in the context of the way that President Trump has demanded. So they've done that. Is President Putin going to do something similar? And if he doesn't, to your question, how does the president respond? Now, he has the threat of the secondary sanctions that certainly is hanging over the head of Russia. They don't really seem to have any significant impact thus far, although I think it's important to note that it has forced significant changes in the Russian economy, the Russian import markets, and the way that they have adapted to it. So it is not as significant of an impact as it once may have had. But the question is, what does President Trump do? The unpredictability of this process of does Trump say, all right, we're going to start sending a long-range precision strike. We're going to give Ukraine all the ISR that they need. By all means, go for it. Putin is not playing with a straight bat. Or does President Trump say, hey, look, I've tried to do this. It's not necessarily going to go the way that I want it because I don't have parties who want to agree. If we go back historically, typically what you've seen is that you bring in the senior executive, the president, when there's a deal to be struck. This isn't a part of the negotiations. These negotiations happen in Moscow and Washington, and then the presidents come together and they sign something. If we look at what the president has managed to achieve with Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example, he came in at the last minute and said, here's a deal, let's sign it. Now we're seeing the president actually stepping into the role of this negotiator, hands-on. My deals that I've wanted to have come to fruition have not. So I need to roll up the sleeves and get in there. Witkoff's done a good job. General Kellogg's done a good job. My guys have tried to do the job, but now I need to come in and step in. So now it puts a bit of credibility on the line for the president. Like, is he going to be able to negotiate with someone who is a very canny operator? I mean, President Putin is an intelligence officer. He has been around for a long time. He has dealt with Gerhard Schroeder and Angela Merkel. You go through the list of presidents that he's dealt with President Putin and President Bush and et cetera. So it's going to be very interesting in this dynamic and how does this play out? And if it doesn't succeed, then what? And that's that unknown variable that I think introduces the strategic unpredictability that makes it actually potentially more interesting in the back end, because you don't quite know what the president is going to do. This is not a President Biden who's saying, okay, we tried to do this, we communicated things, we're going to impose some sanctions. And it's very regimented, very rote, and very predictable. President Trump is anything but that. I mean, he is a Manhattan property dealer now going to the highest level of nation state diplomacy. You don't know how he's going to react to this. And so I think that's where it's going to be. We don't know much and can't predict much in a normal environment with U.S.-Russia relations. Now we definitely can't predict kind of what will happen.
So, and I'm wondering too what the role of Congress would be. Should some sort of deal come about at this meeting, will they need to take action? Will it need to be ratified? Is it actually a treaty? What is it?
Mhm.
And I think Congress has certainly been reticent to take a forward-leaning posture on foreign policy, at least on the Republican side, during the Trump, thus
Mhm.
far in this iteration of the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on how GOP, senators and House members will handle various potential outcomes?
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because you're absolutely right. Congress, especially the GOP, has been very reticent thus far to really roll up the sleeves and get involved in foreign policy, and ceding much more authority to what is the apotheosis, the imperial presidency, really, even more so than previous Congresses. What's going to be interesting is that at a very base level, the Ukrainians enjoy quite high and significant support amongst Congress, certainly at an individual level, and certainly amongst the American people.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is going to come into the element where we find we have to make trade-offs, and that's what's really driving a lot of the conversation. Is Elbridge Colby, as Undersecretary of Defense, is doing a great job communicating the fact that we can't do everything everywhere all at once. We have to make this balance and trade-offs. And so a lot of the arguments that have underpinned what the president has put forward in terms of expecting greater burden sharing by the allies, the United States wants to prioritize the Indo-Pacific and downgrade its involvement and engagement in the Euro-Atlantic theater, are things that are shared by Congress. And about the resolution of the situation, whether it's a treaty, whether it's some sort of agreement, whether it's some sort of accord, whether Congress will have a hand in it, very much remains to be seen as to what the structure of the agreement is. I don't imagine you're going to see some sort of formal treaty that's going to require congressional assent and approval. It's probably going to be something that's going to be brokered between Ukraine and Russia, to which the United States might be some sort of party to. And then again, the question you raised earlier on at the outset is, where do the Europeans fit into this?
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea of this discussion of the coalition of the willing, which is, quaint, if we're honest. The fact that you're having the United Kingdom and France and other countries, which are significant partners of the United States and great allies in NATO, are going to introduce some sort of guarantor force between the two conflicting parties.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a realistic situation. And it's even difficult to speculate what they can do when we don't know what the actual structure of the ceasefire looks like. So countries are committing to doing something. They're going to present some sort of force for something that may or may not happen. So it is a demonstration of the process of diplomacy and engagement and trying to come up with a creative solution. Great. But until you know what that solution looks like, you can't really backplan against it. Mm-hmm. So for the GOP, I think they're looking to the president, or we go back to the congressional side, they're looking to the president saying, okay, what are you going to be able to do? And then what is politically palatable and acceptable on our set? Senator Graham has been very forward-leaning, pushing the significant secondary sanctions on there,
Mm-hmm.
Giving the president the potential tool and authority to implement those. But we also have to remember there are a number of sanction packages that Congress has passed thus far that have not been fully
Right.
There are significant Russian banks that are still on the SWIFT network. There are European companies and partners that are providing material assistance to Russia through existing deals in terms of CNC lubricants and things like that, let alone the Chinese. So I get a bit hesitant when people are saying, well, we need to slap more sanctions onto it. It's like, well, let's enforce the sanctions we already have. Let's go after the shadow fleet that we know exists.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start looking at those pressure points that we already know exist and can do something, let alone trying to, we've come up with a new solution for it. So it's a very long-winded answer of saying it's difficult to know because we're speculating about something that we're still speculating that is going to happen, but we don't know what will it fully entail.
Well, and maybe the congressional role is holding the administration accountable for implementing the laws that are on the books, right? To your point on things not being implemented, sanctions not being implemented on the executive branch side. So I have another question, which I know you're a history buff. Just curious. I know this may not be the history that you focused on, but that of Alaska. Why Alaska? What significance does the meeting in Alaska have? You know, and how do Russians view Alaska and that history? Just would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I will admit I'm wading into territory where I'm not specifically an expert on this whole area. Obviously, Alaska was at one point Russian territory. It was bought from Russia well before they knew the kind of oil and gold and gas resources and everything that were there. So it's a bit of a reverse buyer's remorse. It was like, ah, darn, we sold something that was pretty useful and valuable to us, in hindsight for it. There is a segment of Russian nationalism that does have ambitions of retaking Alaska at some point in the future, either by conquest, negotiation, or something, which is, again, to use the word quaint, I think. Russian nationalists and propagandists are quite amusing at the best of times, but this one in particular is saying that they're going to retake it is just, that's nice. Good luck, guys. It being across the Bering Strait, it being between the point of Washington and Moscow, I think that presents a bit of significance for it. I think the New York Times had an article out today about the fact that neither party, either President Trump or President Putin, should probably expect too warm of a reception in Alaska, just by virtue of not necessarily either one is pretty popular at the moment there, but that remains to be seen. So I think there are historical parallels. The fact that it was Russian territory, now it is United States territory, and has been since I think 1873 or something like that. I'm gonna get that wrong, so please, actual history buffs out there, don't draw and quarter me on this one. But I think it's the fact that they're trying to meet on semi-neutral ground, even though it's obviously United States territory. This is not going to be Helsinki. This is not going to be Reykjavik. It's not going to be kind of one of those summits, but I think there's also parallels there in the fact that it's a cold, wintry climate most of the time. So it kind of fits along that nice latitude perspective.
Well, on that note, I think we can call it a wrap. So just thank you so much to Kelly Crowley, Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for help producing today's episode. Special thanks, of course, to Joshua Huminski, who was stalwart in joining us today. And join us on Wednesday, August 13th for another episode of Fault Lines, NSI's podcast to get you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're also on YouTube, so please check it out. And if you like what you saw or heard, rate, review, and subscribe.